I don't think Philemon is one of the most theologically dense books in the New Testament. It's so short and it's so brief that it gets ignored, I think. So this is the letter of Paul to Philemon. It's really a personal letter of Paul. He's in prison, and he finds there's this slave, and he sends him back to his master with this letter.
Philemon was the person to whom Paul wrote about a slave called Onesimus. And actually it's one of a few shafts of humour that Paul has, because the word is also connected with what can be translated as useful. And he says, please take back this runaway slave, but so that he's really useful, don't treat him as a slave, but treat him as a friend.
Paul's in prison, and he's found a runaway slave, and he thinks the right thing to do is to send this guy back. So he sent him with a letter of explanation and apology, and says to Philemon, accept this guy back. I want you to act Christianly with him.
So the letter is a short one because it's a personal plea to Philemon. Receive back your slave and treat him well.
So Paul says, if you consider me your partner, welcome him like you'd welcome me. Give the guy a break. He's come back. He made a mistake. It's in the Bible as a letter of Paul. Paul wrote a lot of New Testament letters, and he was one of the great early apostles. And his letters were very early on treasured by the church and preserved as worthy of reflection and as useful letters for the teaching of the church. It has something to say, I think, about the ethics of Christian slavery, but beyond that, I think it's one of the least read and the least used New Testament letters.
You shouldn't just use the epistle to Philemon to talk about slavery. The fate of a slave could vary from being regarded as a mere thing, Latin res, a thing, and they could be treated like rubbish. On the other hand, there's no doubt that many people sold themselves deliberately into slavery because it could be a really good career. If you were literate or numerate, you might find a wealthy Roman who wasn't literate or numerate, who was looking for somebody to manage his estate. And to buy a slave, to work for 10 years from age 20 to 30 as a good manager, and to leave with a bit of a bonus and be released at early 30s, you've got the rest of your life in front of you. So although slavery was foul for some people, for other people, depending on what kind of master you had, it was a really important way of making things in life.
Philemon has in it a prayer of Paul, which the churches now take up and use it's quite a famous prayer. I'll read it. When I remember you in my prayers, I always thank my God, because I hear of your love for all the saints and your faith towards the Lord Jesus. I pray that the sharing of your faith may become effective when you perceive all the good that we may do for Christ. I have indeed received much joy and encouragement from your love, because the hearts of the saints have been refreshed through you, my brother. So this prayer has been a prayer that's been taken up by the church and used to pray for its own missionaries and its own life. It's used in Sunday worship, and it's used privately as Christians pray for each other.
Paul was constantly in danger of jail. We have accounts in the Acts of the Apostles, another New Testament book, of his constantly being imprisoned. Often a city would be put into uproar, especially by members of the Jewish community, because they felt threatened by the preaching of the gospel. And of course, Roman officials, or even the officials of the city, would want to keep the peace, and sometimes putting Paul in prison was an important way of doing it. But the later epistles, Philippians, Colossians, and Ephesians, are a different kind of imprisonment, because when Paul was brought before the Jewish governor in Jerusalem, he appealed to Caesar. And by appealing to Caesar, it meant that he had to be taken to Rome and kept in protective custody while Caesar sorted out the case. We've never known what, probably Nero by that time, said about the case, but we know that he was under house arrest, or you could call it prison, in the latest years of his life. We simply don't know whether he got out and went to Spain, although that's what he intended to do.